The air was thick with the crisp scent of fallen leaves, the kind that only October could bring. Driving through the winding back roads of Tennessee, I felt the familiar pull of nostalgia. Cold Creek, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on the map, had always seemed to exist in its own little bubble of time. Today I was venturing into its heart, seeking something simple, a perfect pumpkin. Nothing fancy, just a fresh one for a pie I'd promised to bake for a friend's gathering. I spotted the turnoff to the farm almost by accident. The sign, barely legible, beneath layers of peeling paint, swayed precariously on a single hinge. Silas's Pumpkins, it read, or at least that's what I thought it said. The rest was a blur of faded letters. I turned onto the narrow dirt road, the crunch of gravel under my tires echoing in the quiet. Shadows stretched long across the landscape, cast by skeletal trees that lined the path like silent sentinels. A thickening fog curled lazily at their roots, as though the land itself was exhaling. The farm came into view suddenly, almost like a mirage emerging from the mist. The house, a sagging structure of weathered wood, stood as if it had been forgotten by time. A rickety fence encircled the property, leaning at odd angles as though it had given up on standing tall. What struck me most was the eerie stillness. No chickens clucking, no dogs barking, not even the faint hum of a tractor in the distance. Just silence, as heavy and suffocating as the fog. I parked my truck near the gate and hesitated, my hand lingering on the door handle. The place felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Shaking off the unease, I stepped out into the cool air. As I approached the gate, a figure appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. The man, if you could call him that, was hunched and wiry, with a frame so thin it looked like the wind might topple him over. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his voice reached me before his features did. "You here for pumpkins?" His words were slow and deliberate, as though each syllable was dragged from the depths of some hidden place. "Yes, I heard you have the best ones around," I replied, trying to sound casual. My voice felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. He didn't respond immediately, just tilted his head as if sizing me up. Then, with a gesture of his bony hand, he beckoned me to follow. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the damp earth. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, swirling around my boots like it had a mind of its own. Ahead, a rusted pickup truck loomed in the haze. It was parked beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches gnarled and claw-like. The truck bed was filled to the brim with pumpkins, if you could call them that. They weren't like any pumpkins I'd ever seen. Some were grotesquely oversized, their surfaces riddled with deep ridges and unnatural bulges. Others were small and lopsided, their shapes almost humanoid. And then there were the ones with markings, grotesque swirls and indentations that looked like faces caught mid-scream. "Take your pick," the man rasped. I turned to respond, but he was already stepping back into the fog. His silhouette faded until it was no more than a smudge in the gray. And then, just like that, he was gone. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. My eyes drifted back to the pumpkins. Were they moving? No, it had to be a trick of the fog, the dim light playing tricks on my mind. But I could swear they were closer than they had been a moment ago. I took a step back, and then another. My heart pounded as the stillness seemed to amplify, the air growing heavier with every passing second. Without looking back, I turned and bolted toward my truck, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoing like gunshots in the eerie silence. As I slammed the truck door behind me, my hands trembled against the wheel. The key turned in the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life, breaking the oppressive silence. My headlights pierced the fog, illuminating the narrow path ahead, but something in the rearview mirror caught my attention. The truck bed, the one brimming with those grotesque pumpkins, seemed to shimmer faintly in the mist. It was as if the air around it pulsed with an unnatural energy. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the road. My foot pressed hard on the gas, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel before catching traction. The path twisted and turned, flanked by towering trees whose branches hung low, almost as if they were reaching for the truck. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the taillights of the farm behind me, but my unease only deepened. Something wasn't right. The road seemed longer than it had been on the way in. I couldn't recall so many bends, nor the way the trees seemed to close in overhead, blotting out what little light the fading day offered. The mist clung to the windshield, swirling in erratic patterns under the wipers. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the wheel tighter, every nerve in my body screaming to get as far away from that place as possible. And yet, the farm lingered in my thoughts. The old man's voice, gravelly and detached, replayed in my mind. Take your pick. His tone was devoid of the warmth you'd expect from a farmer eager to sell his produce. No, there was something else in those words, something that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't changed since I left the farm. The hands were frozen at 4:47 p.m., though I was certain at least 10 minutes had passed. The unease swelled into full-blown panic. My eyes darted between the clock and the road ahead, my chest tightening with every passing second. The headlights caught movement up ahead, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the road. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt mere feet from the man. It was him. Silas. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same hunched posture. But how? I had left him at the farm. My pulse thundered as I stared at the figure through the windshield, half expecting him to dissolve into the mist. He didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, we sat locked silent standoff, the fog wrapping around us like a living thing. Finally, he raised a hand, not a wave, but a slow, deliberate motion, beckoning me forward. My instincts screamed to reverse, to turn around and find another way out, but my hands wouldn't move. They remained frozen on the wheel as if bound by some unseen force. I blinked, and Silas was gone. Not a single trace of him remained, the road ahead empty once more. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned back against the seat, willing myself to calm down. Whatever was happening, I needed to focus on getting out of there. The truck groaned as I shifted into gear and pressed forward, the road stretching endlessly before me. The fog seemed to thicken with every mile, its ghostly tendrils snaking across the windshield. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, as though the mirrors showed nothing but impenetrable gray. And then, just as abruptly as it began, the mist cleared. The road opened up into the familiar landscape of Cold Creek's outskirts, the town's modest skyline visible in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something had changed. I could feel it deep in my bones. I drove straight home, my body moving on autopilot. As I parked in my driveway, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. What made my stomach drop was the faint outline of something behind me, something that looked eerily like a pumpkin. When I stumbled out of the truck and into the cool evening air, I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved and my legs threatened to give out beneath me. I turned to look at the truck bed, my stomach twisting in knots. It was empty. No pumpkins, no shadows, nothing. But the memory of that fleeting image in the mirror burned in my mind, a grotesque shape, malformed and unnatural. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The silence of my home, once comforting, now felt oppressive. I flipped on every light, but even the warm glow of the bulbs couldn't chase away the icy dread creeping into every corner of my mind. Sitting on the couch, I tried to rationalize. Maybe the fog had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe exhaustion and adrenaline had warped my perception. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The clock on the wall read 7:15 p.m. I hadn't even noticed the sun setting. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Time was moving again. That small reassurance allowed me to think clearly, or so I thought. I decided to pour myself a drink, something to steady my nerves. As I reached for the bottle, a faint sound echoed from the back of the house. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it froze me in place. A creak. Then another. My breath caught. Someone or something was inside. Gripping the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, I crept toward the hallway. Each step felt like an eternity, the wooden floor beneath me groaning in protest. I strained to listen, and there it was again. The sound was rhythmic now, a subtle thumping that grew louder as I neared the kitchen. The smell hit me first, earthy and damp like freshly turned soil. It was suffocating, filling the air with a cloying weight. As I rounded the corner, the sight stopped me dead in my tracks. There on my kitchen table sat a pumpkin. It wasn't one of the grotesque ones from the farm. At least, not at first glance. But as I approached, I noticed the faint ridges along its surface, the unnatural dips and curves that seemed to form a distorted face. Its hollow eyes appeared to watch me, and its jagged mouth, though unmoving, radiated malice. I didn't put it there. I hadn't brought anything home. My heart hammered as I stepped back, the flashlight trembling in my grip, and then the thumping stopped. Silence. Heavy, deafening silence. The pumpkin moved. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift, a tilt as if it were adjusting to get a better look at me. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Its surface began to crack, thin lines spider-webbing across the skin. A faint glow seeped out from within, growing brighter with each passing second. And then, a voice. Low, guttural, and barely a whisper, yet it filled the room. "You picked me." I didn't wait to hear more. My instincts took over, and I bolted. The door to the backyard flew open under my weight, and I sprinted into the darkness. My feet pounded against the grass, my lungs burning as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Behind me, I heard it. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It followed me out of the house, relentless and unyielding. The glowing cracks in the pumpkin's surface lit the night like an otherworldly beacon. And then it began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that shook me to my core. I reached the truck and fumbled for the keys. My hands shook so violently I could barely get them into the lock. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the empty streets. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped away without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. Parking under a flickering streetlight, I sat in silence, trying to process what had happened, but no amount of rational thought could explain the impossible. I only knew one thing for certain. I would never return to Cold Creek, and no matter how far I went, I could never escape the pumpkin's voice, whispering softly in the back of my mind. "You picked me." The crisp mountain air hit my face as James and I stepped out of the car, gravel crunching beneath our boots. The drive up to the cabin had been long but scenic, winding through endless rows of pine trees that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. Vermont was everything I'd hoped it would be in the fall, vivid reds and oranges blanketing the hills, with an occasional glimpse of a lazy creek or an old barn tucked into the landscape. The cabin stood before us, tucked at the edge of a clearing. Its wooden exterior was aged but charming, with a small wraparound porch and an old rocking chair swaying gently in the breeze. It looked like something out of a storybook, a kind of place that promised peace and quiet, far away from the chaos of city life. I had been the one to find it online. A weekend escape from Chicago where James and I could unplug and reconnect. The listing had boasted rustic charm and complete privacy. But standing there, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Maybe it was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind I'd expected. It was heavier, oppressive in a way I couldn't quite explain. James, oblivious as always, was already unloading our bags from the car. I pushed the unease aside. It was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me after the long drive. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and something faintly musky, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. The furniture was mismatched but cozy. Plush armchairs, a sturdy wooden table, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A small kitchen with dated appliances was tucked into the corner, and a steep staircase led to the loft bedroom above. "This is perfect," James said, setting our bags down with a grin. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself smiling despite the lingering oddness I couldn't quite shake. He lit a fire while I unpacked, the sound of crackling wood filling the space. We opened a bottle of wine, toasting to our weekend getaway. The first few hours passed exactly as I'd hoped. We made a simple dinner, laughing over shared memories, the weight of work and life back in Chicago melting away. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and purple, I was feeling more at ease. But as night settled in, the cabin took on a different energy. Shadows stretched longer, the firelight flickering across the walls in strange patterns. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old wooden walls. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that this was what we'd signed up for. an adventure, a break from the sterile predictability of the city. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound like something tapping against wood. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't fade or shift like wind would. Instead, it grew louder, deliberate. It was coming from below us. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. "James," I whispered, nudging him awake. He groaned, rolling over, but when the sound came again, his eyes flew open. "What is that?" he asked, his voice groggy but tinged with concern. I shook my head, my throat dry. The tapping continued, steady and unnerving. It was coming from the floorboards beneath us, echoing faintly through the stillness of the cabin. James swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbing his phone to use as a flashlight. "It's probably nothing," he said, more to reassure himself than me. But his voice betrayed a hint of unease. We both sat in silence, straining to listen. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over, that we'd imagined it. But then it started again, louder this time, from the direction of the kitchen. James led the way down the narrow staircase, his phone's flashlight cutting a faint path through the darkness. I followed close behind, every creak of the wooden steps making my heart jump. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like a metronome keeping time. The sound grew louder as we descended, echoing through the cabin's silence. The kitchen was just as we had left it earlier that evening, but the noise wasn't coming from there. James scanned the room with his phone, the beam of light bouncing off the counters and the old refrigerator. Then we heard it again, directly beneath us. "It's coming from the basement," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned toward the small door at the far end of the kitchen, half hidden by a wooden hutch. I hadn't even noticed it earlier. The door looked ancient, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. James hesitated for a moment before reaching out to pull it open. It creaked loudly, like revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. A musty, damp smell wafted up from below, making me recoil. "Do we have to go down there?" I asked, clutching his arm. My voice was shaky, my instincts screaming at me to stay as far away from that place as possible. "We can't just ignore it," he replied, though his own uncertainty was evident. He stepped forward, and I reluctantly followed, gripping his shirt like a lifeline. The flashlight barely penetrated the thick shadows as we descended the rickety stairs. The air grew colder with every step, and the tapping sound became more distinct. It wasn't just random knocking, it was deliberate, like someone trying to get attention. When we reached the bottom, James swung the flashlight in a slow arc. The basement was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture, rusted tools, and boxes stacked haphazardly. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp, and the walls were made of rough stone that seemed to absorb the light. And then, in the farthest corner, the beam of light landed on him. A man. He was slumped against the wall, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes tattered and dirty. He blinked against the sudden light, his eyes wide with panic. "Help me," he rasped, his voice raw and broken. "Please." James froze, and I grabbed his arm, yanking him backward. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" James demanded, his voice firm but shaky. The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed weak, like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were bound loosely in front of him with a piece of frayed rope. "The owner," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He locked me in here. Please don't leave me." My stomach turned. The owner? The listing had said nothing about anyone else being here. The idea that someone had been trapped in the basement while we sat upstairs out completely oblivious made my blood run cold. James stepped closer, but I pulled him back. "We need to call the police," I insisted, my voice trembling. "This isn't safe." The man's eyes darted between us, filled with a desperate kind of hope. "Don't leave me," he begged again. "He'll come back." "Who?" James asked, kneeling cautiously beside him. "Who's coming back?" "The owner," he repeated, his voice growing more frantic. "He's not normal." James stood, his face pale, and fumbled for his phone. The man continued to mutter incoherently, his words a jumbled mix of fear and warnings. I couldn't stop staring at him, at the haunted look in his eyes, the way his body trembled as though he were freezing despite the damp heat of the basement. The tapping sound stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on all sides. James raised his phone to call the police, his fingers shaking as he dialed. As he waited for the operator, I thought I heard something, faint footsteps on the floor above us. "Someone's here," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. James looked up at me, his face stricken. The man in the corner began to cry softly, his head dropping to his chest. And then, from the darkness of the basement, we heard a new sound. A slow, deliberate creak, like a door opening upstairs. James's voice cracked as he hurriedly relayed the situation to the 911 operator. "We found a man. He says he's been locked in the basement. Yes, we're still here. Please, send someone quickly." His words tumbled over each other, his panic evident. I stood frozen, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling above us. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the cabin. The operator's faint voice filtered through James's phone, giving instructions, but I could hardly hear her over the pounding of my heart. The man in the corner began to mutter again, his words low and frantic. "He's here. He knows. You shouldn't have come down here." I whipped my head toward him. "What do you mean? Who's here?" My voice was sharper than I intended, but fear had taken hold of me. The man just shook his head, tears streaming down his sunken cheeks. He looked as if he wanted to disappear into the wall behind him. James grabbed my arm and pulled me close. "We need to get upstairs. The police are on their way," he whispered. He gestured for the man to follow us, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the stairs, as if something invisible were holding him back. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have opened the door." A cold dread settled over me. "What door?" Before he could answer, the footsteps above us stopped. Silence descended again, but it wasn't a relief. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, made your skin crawl. I grabbed James's arm tighter as we began to ascend the stairs, our movements slow and cautious. The man didn't follow. He simply sat there, shaking his head, his whispers turning to soft sobs. We reached the top of the stairs, James pushing the basement door open slowly. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of his phone. Everything looked untouched, but the oppressive stillness was unbearable. I swallowed hard, straining to hear anything, breathing, movement, anything that would explain the footsteps we'd heard. And then it came. A low, guttural creak from the living room. The rocking chair on the porch, visible through the small window, was swaying, but there was no wind. James gestured for us to move toward the front door. My hands were trembling as I reached for the knob, but just as my fingers brushed it, the rocking stopped. Something heavy slammed against the back door of the cabin. I jumped, letting out a muffled scream. James spun around, his phone's light darting across the room. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone or something was trying to get in. "Get outside!" James shouted, pulling me toward the door. He flung it open, the cold night air rushing in. We stumbled onto the porch, barely pausing to grab the keys to the car. The rocking chair sat motionless now, an eerie reminder of what we'd just seen. As we sprinted to the car, headlights suddenly illuminated the gravel driveway. A patrol car screeched to a halt, two officers stepping out with flashlights raised. "What's going on here?" one of them barked, his tone sharp but steady. "There's a man in the basement," James yelled. "He says he's been trapped there." The officers exchanged a glance before heading inside, their footsteps purposeful. We stayed by the car, shivering despite the relative warmth of the night. My eyes never left the house, every shadow and flicker of light from the flashlights inside making my breath catch. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the officers emerged, their faces grim. One of them shook his head. "There's no one down there." James and I froze. "What?" I stammered. "He was right there. We saw him." The officer's expression didn't change. "The basement's empty," he said firmly. "But the door, it was locked from the outside." My knees buckled, and James caught me before I hit the ground. "We're leaving," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. He didn't wait for a response. He got me into the car and sped off without looking back. The cabin disappeared into the darkness behind us, but the image of that man, his sunken face and desperate whispers, stayed with me. As we reached the main road, I thought I could still hear the faint creak of the rocking chair following us into the night. The basketball bounced rhythmically against the gym floor, the sound echoing in the empty space. I always stayed late after practice, working on my free throws while the other guys either showered or left in a rush to meet their friends. The gym had become my sanctuary, the one place where I felt like I could prove myself. Roosevelt High School wasn't known for its basketball team, but for me, it was everything. Hey, Mike, you coming? Jason's voice snapped me out of my focus. He stood by the double doors, his duffel bag slung casually over one shoulder, a grin plastered on his face. Jason was everything I wasn't: confident, charismatic, and the undisputed leader of our team. I'll be there in a minute, I replied, forcing a smile. I knew he didn't really care about waiting for me. I wasn't his friend. I was just the rookie, the kid who worked too hard and tried too much. He shrugged and left, the doors swinging shut behind him. I sank another shot, the ball swishing through the net. The empty gym felt larger without anyone else there, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the high walls. I let out a breath and grabbed my backpack, deciding to call it a night. As I entered the locker room, the familiar scent of sweat and damp towels hit me. Most of the team had already cleared out, but a few stragglers remained, laughing and joking by the benches. Jason was among them, his voice rising above the others. Hey, Mike! Come here for a sec, he called. I hesitated. There was something in his tone, a casual arrogance that always put me on edge. Still, I walked over, clutching the strap of my backpack like it might anchor me to the ground. What's up? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Jason exchanged a glance with one of the other guys, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. We need your help with something. You cool? Sure, I said, the unease settling in my chest. Great. Follow me. He motioned for me to follow him toward the storage room, a small, dark space tucked behind the showers. The other guys trailed behind us, their laughter low and conspiratorial. When we reached the storage room, Jason opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. There's a box we need you to grab. It's on the top shelf. I peered inside. The room was cramped, filled with old equipment and forgotten uniforms. Which one? Just step in and take a look, Jason said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. I stepped inside, scanning the shelves. Before I could realize what was happening, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating in the tiny space. Hey! I shouted, spinning around. I pounded on the door, but it didn't budge. From the other side, I heard the unmistakable click of a lock. Laughter erupted from the other side, muffled but unmistakable. Relax, rookie! Jason's voice came through, his tone full of amusement. We'll let you out, eventually. I yelled again, slamming my fists against the metal door, but their laughter only grew fainter as they walked away. And then, silence. The darkness closed in around me, and my chest tightened. I reached for my phone, only to remember it was in my backpack, on the bench outside. I was completely alone. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides as I sat huddled in the cramped storage room. My hands trembled as I ran them along the cold metal walls of the locker, searching for some kind of weakness. Every sound seemed amplified. The distant hum of the gym's fluorescent lights, the faint creak of the building settling. My breathing was loud and uneven, and I had to force myself to slow it down before the panic took over completely. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank. Jason and the others probably thought it was hilarious. They'd come back eventually, right? But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, doubt crept in. Had they forgotten about me? Or worse, had they left for the night? I shifted uncomfortably, my legs cramping in the tight space. The air inside the locker was stale and thick, and I could feel the sweat from practice clinging to my skin, making the heat even more oppressive. I leaned my head back against the wall and tried to focus on the faint sound of a distant clock ticking, anything to distract myself from the rising fear in my chest. Then I heard something, a faint sound like footsteps, echoing across the empty gym. My pulse quickened, and I froze, straining to listen. Was it Jason coming back? Or the janitor finishing his rounds? I swallowed hard and pressed my ear to the door, hoping to catch another sound, but the silence returned. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky and hoarse. It echoed weakly, swallowed by the vast emptiness beyond the locker. I banged on the door again, harder this time. I'm in here. Can anyone hear me? No answer. My fists hurt from pounding on the door, but I couldn't stop. I screamed until my throat felt raw, the desperation bubbling over. I couldn't stay here all night. What if they never came back? What if nobody knew I was here? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents wouldn't even realize I was missing until morning. The gym was supposed to be locked for the weekend after tonight's practice. I clenched my fists, my breathing shallow and rapid. The walls felt like they were closing in, the locker becoming tighter with each passing second. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but the memories of Jason's smirk and the sound of the lock clicking echoed in my mind. I could almost hear their laughter again, taunting me. Anger began to replace my fear, a hot surge of frustration that gave me the energy to push harder against the door. But it wouldn't budge. Time blurred in the suffocating darkness. I lost track of how long I'd been in there. An hour? 2? Every sound outside felt like a lifeline, but every moment of silence drove me deeper into despair. My mind played tricks on me, making me think I heard voices or footsteps when there was nothing but stillness. And then, just when I was beginning to accept that I might have to spend the night there, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were steady and deliberate, growing louder as they approached the storage room. My heart raced, equal parts hope and fear. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice trembling. I banged on the door with renewed vigor. "I'm in here. Please, help!" There was a pause, and then the door creaked open. The sudden flood of light blinded me momentarily, and I squinted against the harsh glare. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Thompson, the school janitor, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What in the world are you doing in here, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I stumbled out of the locker, my legs shaky and my throat dry. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a flood of emotions, embarrassment, anger, and something deeper, something heavier. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "It's okay," Mr. Thompson said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of here." I followed Mr. Thompson out of the storage room, my legs still weak and unsteady. The fluorescent lights of the gym were almost blinding after the hours spent in the dark. My heart was still pounding, and my body felt drained, like I'd run a marathon. He didn't say much as we walked, his weathered face pinched with concern. He guided me to a bench near the bleachers, where I sank down, trying to catch my breath. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked after a long silence. His voice was steady but gentle, giving me space to speak when I was ready. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain what happened without sounding pathetic? Without admitting I'd let Jason and the others humiliate me? I stared down at my hands, which were still trembling slightly. Finally, I muttered, "It was some of the guys from the team. They thought it would be funny." Mr. Thompson's frown deepened, his eyes narrowing. "Funny? Locking someone in a storage locker for hours? That's not funny, son. That's cruel." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. I'd been trying to convince myself it was just a prank, something harmless, but there was nothing harmless about the fear and helplessness I'd felt in that dark, suffocating space. "Do your parents know about this?" he asked, crossing his arms. "No," I said quickly, panic rising in my chest. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble." He let out a long sigh, his gaze softening. "Trouble? Those boys need to learn that this kind of behavior has consequences, and you need to stand up for yourself." The thought of confronting Jason and the others made my stomach churn. They already saw me as weak. Reporting them would only make things worse, wouldn't it? But as I sat there, replaying the night's events in my mind, I realized something. I didn't care what they thought of me anymore. I didn't want their approval, their acceptance. I just wanted to feel safe, to belong somewhere I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. "Let's get you home," Mr. Thompson said, his tone softer now. "You've been through enough tonight?" I nodded and followed him out of the gym, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. The stars were bright overhead, a stark contrast to the darkness I'd been trapped in just minutes ago. My parents were waiting at the front entrance, their faces pale with worry. Mr. Bay Thompson must have called them while I was still inside. As soon as my mom saw me, she rushed over and pulled me into a tight hug. "We were so worried," she said, her voice shaking. "Are you okay? What happened?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let her hold me, the warmth of her embrace finally melting some of the tension in my body. When I pulled back, I saw the questions in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. "Not yet." The drive home was quiet. My parents didn't press me for details, sensing that I needed time. I stared out the window, the familiar streets of our neighborhood passing by in a blur. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted but unable to sleep. Over the next few days, the weight of what had happened didn't lift. I tried to go back to practice, but every time I stepped into the gym, the memories came rushing back. The cold, the darkness, the sound of the lock clicking shut. I couldn't focus, couldn't pretend like everything was fine. Finally, I made a decision. I quit the team. It wasn't easy. I'd worked so hard to make it, to prove that I belonged, but I realized it wasn't worth it. Not if it meant being surrounded by people who didn't respect me, who thought it was okay to hurt others for a laugh. Walking away felt like a defeat at first, but it didn't take long for me to see it differently. Leaving the team opened doors I hadn't noticed before. I started spending more time with other kids at school, people who shared my interests, who didn't care about my jump shot or my place on the roster. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be myself. The scars of that night didn't disappear, but they became a part of my story, a reminder of what I'd endured and what I'd learned. And slowly, I started to move forward. The night was unusually quiet, even for my neighborhood. The soft hum of the heater was the only sound breaking the stillness in the house. I had just settled into the couch with my laptop, a steaming cup of chamomile tea on the coffee table, and a playlist of mellow piano tunes playing softly in the background. Outside, the world seemed wrapped in a cocoon of darkness, the streetlights casting faint, diffused halos through the thick, low-hanging fog. Nights like this were the reason I had chosen this house, a small, cozy escape at the edge of town. It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to the solitude. The house was a charming craftsman style, with warm wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of light during the day. At night, though, it took on a different character. Shadows gathered in the corners, stretching across the walls in flickering patterns cast by the light of the fireplace. I usually found it comforting, but tonight something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the stillness outside, too perfect, like the world was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the way the fog clung to the windows, distorting the view of the street beyond. I brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I'd been working nonstop for days, and my mind was likely playing tricks on me. As I typed away, lost in my thoughts, a faint sound broke the rhythm of the night. At first, I thought it was part of the music, a soft, almost hesitant knock. But when I paused the playlist, the sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably real. My chest tightened as I glanced toward the front door. The knock came again, insistent now, echoing in the silence. My hand hovered over my phone, but I hesitated. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to drop by, but this was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, I rose from the couch, my bare feet making almost no sound against the floorboards. Peeking through the small side window next to the door, I froze. Standing on the porch was a child, a girl no older than 7 or 8. She wore a thick coat that looked far too big for her small frame, her hair messy and falling into her face. She stood motionless, her arms crossed as though she were cold. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. What was a child doing out alone at this hour? I unlocked the door, but left the chain in place as I cracked it open just enough to speak. "Hello?" I asked, my voice gentle but wary. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't answer right away. She raised her head slowly, her eyes wide and dark, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. Before I could say anything else, a shadow shifted behind her. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Then, from the edge of the porch, a figure stepped forward, a man. He was tall, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, and his face was partially obscured by the hood of a thick jacket. "She needs help," he said, his voice low and gravelly. My grip on the door tightened instinctively. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why is she out here?" "She got lost," he replied, his tone calm but cold. He took a step closer, and the dim porch light illuminated his face. There was something off about his expression, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a tension in his features that set my nerves on edge. "I'll call the police to help her," I said quickly, trying to close the door. But before I could, his hand shot out, gripping the edge of the door to keep it from shutting. "Don't bother," he said, his voice sharp now, all pretense of calm gone. "Just let us in." The pressure on the door was unrelenting, the man's hand gripping it with a force that made my pulse race. My mind scrambled for options, but all I could think was, "Keep it shut. Don't let him in." "I said I'm calling the police," I shouted, trying to sound confident, though my voice wavered. My free hand fumbled for my phone on the nearby table. The girl didn't move, didn't even flinch. She stood there, a frozen statue in her oversized coat, her face eerily blank. "Jessica," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. Hearing my name spoken in that tone sent a chill down my spine. How did he know my name? My mind reeled, trying to piece it together. Had I ordered something online? Did I leave a package outside with my name on it? But the why didn't matter. What mattered was that this man, this stranger, knew who I was and was standing on my porch, trying to force his way in. I gritted my teeth and pushed harder against the door. "Leave! Now!" I yelled, mustering every ounce of authority I could. His expression twisted into something darker, more dangerous. "You don't want to do that," he growled, and for the first time, the girl reacted. Her head turned slightly toward him, and though her face remained expressionless, it was enough to unsettle me further. My phone was finally in my hand. I dialed 911, the ringing in my ear almost drowning out the man's next words. "You think they'll get here in time?" he asked, his grin widening into something grotesque. "They never do." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My breath hitched as the operator's voice crackled through the line. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's a man at my door," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "He's trying to break in, and he's not alone. There's a child." Before I could finish, the man shoved the door harder, and I stumbled back. The chain caught, holding the door just enough to stop him from entering completely, but the force rattled the frame. "Please, send someone now!" I yelled into the phone, the panic fully taking over. "We're dispatching officers to your location," the operator assured me. "Stay on the line." The man's hand slipped away from the door as he stepped back, his dark eyes locking onto mine through the narrow crack. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice eerily calm again. He grabbed the girl by the arm, pulling her back from the door. For a split second I thought he might leave, but instead he smiled, a cruel, knowing smile, and disappeared into the shadows beyond the porch. I slammed the door shut, locking it and double-checking the chain. My legs felt like jelly as I backed away, clutching the phone to my ear like a lifeline. "He's gone," I whispered, more to myself than the operator. "He just left." "Stay inside," the operator instructed firmly. "Lock all doors and windows. The officers are on their way." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and glanced toward the living room windows. My chest tightened as I realized how many points of entry there were. Every window, every door felt like a weak spot. I rushed to the nearest window, pulling the curtains tight and checking the latch. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from the side of the house. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I crept toward the noise, my footsteps silent against the floorboards. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across the glass. I froze as I saw it, a shadowy figure outside the living room window. The man was crouched low, his face partially obscured, but I could see his breath fogging the glass. His hand pressed against the window, testing the lock. He looked up and met my eyes. The smile was still there, sharp and predatory, as he mouthed two words I couldn't hear but understood perfectly. "I'm coming." My breath caught in my throat as the man's words, silent but clear, etched themselves into my mind. "I'm coming." I stumbled back, my chest tightening as I clutched the phone to my ear. "He's at the window," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The 911 operator's calm voice broke through the haze of panic. "Stay away from the windows. Is there a safe room you can lock yourself in?" Safe room? My mind scrambled for an answer. This was my house, my safe space. Yet now, every corner felt like a trap. The scratching at the window grew louder, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence pressed down like a weight, amplifying every beat of my racing heart. I don't think so," I stammered, glancing around. The living room felt too exposed. My eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the bathroom and bedroom. I'll go to the bathroom. It locks. Good, the operator said firmly. Take your phone and something to defend yourself. Officers are on their way. I rushed down the hall, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. My mind raced as I tried to think of what I could use as a weapon. A kitchen knife? A heavy lamp? But there wasn't time to go back. I ducked into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My trembling hands grabbed a can of hairspray from the counter. Better than nothing, I thought, even as my stomach churned at the thought of using it. The silence stretched on, oppressive and endless. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. Had he given up? Or was he already inside? The question answered itself with a loud crash from the living room. My whole body jerked as the sound echoed through the house. He was in. My breathing quickened, and I clapped a hand over my mouth, desperate to muffle the sound. Stay calm, the operator's voice urged. Police are only minutes away. They'll be there soon. But minutes felt like an eternity. The sound of heavy boots on the floor sent a shiver down my spine. He was moving deliberately, as though he knew exactly how much time he had to find me. I held the hairspray tightly, my knuckles white, trying to steady my shaking hands. Then came the footsteps in the hallway. Each step creaked against the floorboards, growing closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body taut with fear. When the footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door, I could barely breathe. A moment passed, then another, and then the knob rattled. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming as the door shook violently. Jessica, his voice crooned from the other side, low and mocking. Come on now, don't make this harder. The door held, the lock resisting his attempts to force it open. My mind screamed for the police to get here, to save me, but I couldn't just sit and wait. My grip tightened on the hairspray as I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes locked on the door. A sudden bang against the door made me jump. The sound came again, harder this time, and the wood groaned under the pressure. Just as I thought it might give way, the distant wail of sirens broke through the chaos. The banging stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, but this time it carried a glimmer of hope. I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway, the sound growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. The operator spoke again. Jessica, the officers are outside. Stay where you are until they come to you. A knock on the front door sent a flood of relief through me, followed by the muffled voices of the police announcing themselves. Moments later, I heard them moving through the house, their boots thudding against the floor. Ma'am, it's safe now, one of them called out. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped into the hallway, my knees trembling so badly I could barely stand. The officer's kind eyes met mine, and I choked out a shaky, "Thank you." They searched the property but didn't find him. The man had vanished into the night, leaving no trace except the broken window and the memory of his chilling smile. As the officers escorted me to their patrol car, I glanced back at the house, its windows dark and silent once more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't far, that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And as we drove away, I knew one thing for certain: I'd never feel safe in that house again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a dull orange glow over the playground as Tyler and I sat on the rusted swings. The air was heavy, humid, and carried the faint smell of asphalt from the nearby highway. This place had been our spot for years, a forgotten corner of our small Ohio town, where we could escape from the dullness of summer afternoons. The swings creaked with each back and forth motion, the metal worn and tired, much like the rest of the playground. We'd been quiet for a while, watching cars zip by on the interstate that cut through the fields just beyond the playground. It was always busy, full of drivers rushing to somewhere better, somewhere more important than here. Tyler broke the silence, tossing a pebble in the dirt and smirking. "You ever think they'd notice if we threw something bigger?" he asked, his tone light but mischievous. I rolled my eyes, knowing exactly where this was headed. Tyler was always the one to push boundaries, his endless curiosity and thirst for excitement leading to more than a few close calls. Probably not, I said, half distracted. They're going too fast. That's what I thought, he replied, standing and scanning the ground. He bent down, picking up a rock the size of a golf ball. But we won't know unless we try. Tyler, come on, I muttered, already feeling that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. But as he grinned and wound up his arm, I couldn't help but watch. The rock sailed through the air, hitting the bumper of a passing truck with a dull thunk. Tyler laughed, his eyes lighting up with triumph. See, told you. The truck didn't stop, and for a moment I felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. My nerves gave way to curiosity. What was the harm, really? The cars were moving too fast to care about a little rock. I found a smaller stone and weighed it in my hand. Fine, just one, I said, throwing it at the next car. It bounced harmlessly off the side. Tyler cheered, egging me on, and before I knew it, we were both searching the ground for more ammo. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but the adrenaline was addictive. We kept going, aiming for hubcaps, bumpers, anything that seemed like an easy target. Most of the rocks either missed or hit without consequence, and the drivers never seemed to notice. Then Tyler's rock hit a black sedan, and everything changed. The car swerved slightly, its brake lights flashing bright red. My heart sank as it skidded onto the shoulder of the highway, gravel spraying in all directions. The driver's door flew open, and a man stepped out, slamming it behind him. He was huge, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a heavy build. His movements were deliberate as he walked toward the playground, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. Something in his hand caught the light, a crowbar. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the thudding of my heart. "What?" Tyler asked, still oblivious. "Run," I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the swings. The man moved faster now, his strides long and purposeful. The crowbar dangled in his hand, its metallic edge glinting menacingly. Tyler finally snapped out of his stupor and followed me, his breath coming in panicked gasps as we sprinted across the playground. The swings clanged behind us, the sound echoing like an alarm. I didn't dare look back. We ran, the playground's rusted equipment a blur as we sprinted toward the small hill at its edge. My lungs burned, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to keep going. Tyler was right behind me, his breathing heavy and uneven. Behind us, the man's footsteps pounded the gravel, his strides steady and deliberate, as if he knew we couldn't escape him. "Where do we go?" Tyler gasped, his voice high-pitched with panic. I didn't answer. My mind was a frantic mess, racing through every possibility. The hill led to a small patch of woods behind the playground, and my only thought was to lose him there. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. "Into the trees," I shouted, veering left and practically dragging Tyler with me. We dove into the woods, the branches clawing at our arms and faces as we pushed through the underbrush. The sound of the man's pursuit didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. Every crunch of twigs beneath his boots sent another jolt of fear through me. He wasn't running, not really, just a steady, relentless walk, like he knew he'd catch up eventually. The trees grew denser, and the dim evening light barely penetrated the canopy. I stumbled on a root, nearly falling, but Tyler grabbed my arm and pulled me up. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice shaking. Finally, we reached a clearing. My chest heaved as I scanned the area, searching for a place to hide. At the far end of the clearing was the old structure from the playground, a skeletal climbing frame that hadn't been used in years. It stood like a relic of forgotten childhoods, its metal bars rusted and brittle. "Over there," I said, pointing. Without waiting for Tyler's response, I bolted toward it, my legs feeling like jelly with every step. We crouched beneath the climbing frame, pressing ourselves into the shadows as the man's footsteps drew closer. I could hear him now, bay, his breathing heavy but controlled. He stepped into the clearing, his crowbar swinging loosely in his hand. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Tyler shifted slightly, and the metal frame let out a faint creak. I shot him a warning look, but it was too late. The man's head snapped toward us, his eyes locking onto our hiding spot. For a moment, he didn't move, just stared. Then he took a step forward. "Think you're clever, huh?" he said, his voice low and cold. He took another step, the crowbar scraping against the ground with a metallic shing. Throw rocks at cars and think no one's going to do something about it? Tyler whimpered beside me, and I grabbed his arm, squeezing hard. Stay quiet, I mouthed, though I wasn't sure it would matter. The man reached the edge of the climbing frame, leaning down slightly to peer into the shadows. His face was illuminated by the last rays of sunlight, and I finally saw the full force of his anger. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight, and his lips curled into a snarl. He looked like he wanted to do more than scare us. I know you're there, he said, his voice a sinister growl. He swung the crowbar into the frame, the sound reverberating through the metal like a gunshot. Tyler flinched, and the man's grin widened. Come on out. Let's have a chat. My mind raced. We couldn't stay here. The frame offered no protection, and he'd already seen us. But if we ran, he could easily catch us. I scanned the clearing again, my eyes landing on the dense woods just beyond. If we could make it there, we might have a chance. I leaned close to Tyler and whispered, "When I say go, we run." His wide eyes met mine, full of fear, but he nodded. The man raised the crowbar again, preparing to strike the frame. I didn't wait. Go, I shouted, grabbing Tyler's hand and bolting toward the woods. The man roared behind us, the sound filled with frustration and fury. His footsteps thundered after us, closer this time, but I didn't dare look back. My only focus was on the trees ahead, on putting as much distance as possible between us and the crowbar-wielding maniac. We tore through the woods, the trees whipping past us in a blur. My lungs burned, each breath ragged and shallow, but I couldn't stop. Behind us, the man's furious shouts echoed through the forest, his footsteps crunching through the underbrush. He was relentless, each step filled with a determination that sent chills down my spine. Tyler stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught his arm and yanked him upright. "Keep going," I hissed, my voice barely more than a gasp. He nodded, his face pale and streaked with sweat. The woods grew darker as the sun dipped lower, the thick canopy above swallowing what little light remained. Every shadow seemed alive, and every snap of a branch sounded like it was just inches away. My mind raced with a single thought. Find somewhere to hide. He's too close. Finally, we stumbled into a small ravine, its steep sides offering a momentary sense of shelter. At the bottom, a narrow stream trickled over rocks, the faint sound masking our footsteps. I pulled Tyler down beside me, crouching low behind a cluster of bushes. My chest heaved, and I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to silence my breathing. The forest fell eerily silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. My heart pounded in my ears as I strained to listen for the man's approach. For a moment, I thought we'd lost him. Then a twig snapped nearby. Tyler's eyes widened, and I shook my head sharply, silently begging him to stay still. The sound of heavy boots on the forest floor grew louder, and then we saw him. He stood at the edge of the ravine, the crowbar still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "You think you can hide from me?" he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "I know you're out here. You're just making this worse for yourselves." I clutched Tyler's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as he fought the urge to run. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the ravine, his movements deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. He thought he had us trapped. As he took another step, his foot caught on a loose rock, sending him stumbling slightly. It was a small misstep, but it was enough. My mind seized on the opportunity, and I leaned close to Tyler, whispering so quietly I wasn't sure he could hear me. When he turns his back, we run. Tyler's face was pale, but he nodded, his eyes locked on the man. We waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the man turned, his focus shifting to the far side of the ravine. "Now," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's hand. We bolted up the opposite side of the ravine, our movements as silent as we could manage. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't look back. The sound of the stream and the rustling leaves faded into the background as we ran, weaving through the trees like our lives depended on it, because they did. After what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves back on the edge of the playground. My legs wobbled, and I nearly collapsed onto the grass. Tyler was gasping for air, his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. Did we lose him?" he asked between gasps. I didn't answer right away, my ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The woods behind us were still the only movement coming from the gentle sway of the trees. Finally, I nodded. I think so. We sat in silence for a moment, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. My hands trembled as I wiped sweat from my brow, my mind replaying the image of the man's furious face, the crowbar gleaming in his hand. "Let's go home," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Tyler nodded, and we began the long walk back to the neighborhood, every sound making us jump. We never told anyone what happened. Not our parents, not our friends. No one. But we never went back to that playground either. And every time I heard the distant hum of a car engine or the snap of a twig, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, expecting to see him again. Because some things don't just disappear. Some things linger, just out of sight, waiting.